The first light of dawn filtered through the workshop windows like liquid amber, illuminating particles of sawdust that danced in the still air. Frank Morrison's hands moved with the practiced precision of a man who had spent decades learning that every movement mattered, every detail counted. The piece taking shape beneath his weathered fingers was a jewelry box, delicate inlay work that would have challenged craftsmen half his age. But Frank's hands didn't shake. They never had. At 64, Master Sergeant Frank Morrison looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet retiree who had found peace in the grain of wood and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. His grey hair was neatly trimmed, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he examined a particularly intricate joint. The workshop around him was a testament to order. Every tool in its designated place, every surface clean, every project labelled and organised with military precision. The scent of oak and pine filled the space, mixed with the faint aroma of the Danish oil he used to finish his pieces. This was Frank's sanctuary, the place where he had taught himself to build instead of destroy, to create instead of eliminate. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 25 years in the Marine Corps, most of it spent in force reconnaissance, a world of shadows and sudden violence, he had chosen to work with his hands in the most peaceful way possible. His phone buzzed softly on the workbench. A text from Mrs. Patterson, asking about the dining table he was crafting for her daughter's wedding. Frank allowed himself a small smile. He enjoyed the domestic nature of his work now, the way families trusted him with pieces that would outlast generations. It was a different kind of mission than the ones he'd once undertaken, but the attention to detail was the same. The stakes were simply gentler. By 7:30, Frank had completed the morning's work on the jewelry box and was ready for his daily routine. He locked the workshop carefully, 2 deadbolts and a security system that was more sophisticated than it appeared, and walked to his aging Ford pickup truck. The vehicle was like its owner, unassuming, reliable, and tougher than it looked. The drive to Riverside Cemetery took exactly 12 minutes. Frank had timed it often enough to know. He parked in the same spot he'd used for the past 3 years, since the day he'd buried Margaret, and walked the familiar path to her grave. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with her name, dates, and a single line: "Beloved wife and teacher." From his jacket pocket, Frank withdrew a small wooden flower, a perfect replica of the daisies Margaret had loved, carved from a piece of cherry wood and sanded until it was smooth as silk. He placed it gently beside the headstone, replacing yesterday's flower with today's. This ritual had never missed a day, not in 3 years. "Morning, Maggie," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of conversations he'd never have again. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter is getting married next month. Remember how you always said weddings were the most hopeful thing in the world? I'm making them a table that'll last 50 years, maybe more." He stood in silence for a few minutes, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that had been drilled into him decades ago. A casual observer might have seen an old man talking to a grave. They wouldn't have noticed the way his eyes continuously scanned the cemetery, cataloguing every person, every vehicle, every sight line. Old habits from a dangerous world died hard. "I'll see you tomorrow," Frank said finally, turning to leave. He didn't see the sentiment as morbid. Margaret was gone, but love wasn't something you retired from. The drive back to the workshop took him through downtown, past the medical district where glass towers rose like monuments to human fragility and hope. Frank had spent enough time in military hospitals to know that medicine was often just another kind of war, one fought with different weapons, but the same desperate intensity. 12 miles away, in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of disinfectant and fear, Leo Vance was staring at a stack of medical bills that might as well have been his sister's death sentence. The papers were organized by date and severity, red-stamped notices, final demands, insurance denials. Each one represented another door slamming shut, another option disappearing. Maya was sleeping in the next room, her 13-year-old body so frail that she barely made an impression on the mattress. The rare autoimmune disorder that was eating her alive had a name that Leo could barely pronounce, but he knew its price down to the penny. The experimental treatment that might save her life cost $47,000 per session. Insurance wouldn't cover it. The family's savings were gone. The medical loans were maxed. Out. Leo's hands shook as he shuffled through the papers, looking for something, anything, that might offer hope. At 22, he looked younger, all sharp angles and nervous energy, the kind of kid who had been destined for college before life decided to rewrite his script. His mother worked 16-hour days between two jobs, coming home just long enough to cry quietly in the bathroom before falling into exhausted sleep. His father had vanished when the medical bills started arriving, leaving behind only silence and the bitter taste of abandonment. The apartment's walls were thin enough that Leo could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door trying to calm her crying baby. He could hear the elevated train rumbling past every 20 minutes. He could hear Maya's labored breathing from the next room, the sound that haunted his dreams and followed him through every waking moment. On the kitchen table, next to the bills, lay a printed email from Dr. Aris Thorne at the University Medical Center. Leo had read it so many times that he'd memorized every word, but he read it again anyway, hoping the meaning might somehow change. Mr. Vance, I understand your family's difficult situation, and I wish I could offer different news. Maya's condition has progressed faster than we anticipated. The conventional treatments have been ineffective, and we're now looking at a very narrow window for the experimental protocol. The next infusion needs to be scheduled within the next 2 weeks. I've contacted the pharmaceutical company about compassionate use programs, but the waiting list is extensive. The hospital's charity care office is exploring options, but given your family's income level, you fall into a gap where aid is limited. I want to be clear, this treatment represents Maya's best chance. Without it, we're looking at palliative care options. I'm sorry I can't provide more encouraging news. Please contact my office to discuss next steps. Dr. Aris Thorne. Leo folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. 2 weeks, $47,000. It might as well have been $47 million. He had spent the last month exploring every legal option, fundraising campaigns that barely covered a day's worth of medical expenses, loans that his family couldn't qualify for, charity applications that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Every door had closed, leaving him staring at an impossible choice: watch his sister die or find another way. The gun was hidden in his bedroom closet, wrapped in an old towel behind his winter clothes. He'd gotten it 3 days ago from Marcus, a guy he'd known in high school who had taken a different path after graduation. Marcus hadn't asked questions when Leo said he needed protection for his family. The weapon was old, a .38 revolver that felt heavier than it looked, but it was loaded, and it worked. That was all that mattered. Leo had never fired a gun before, never even held one until 3 days ago. The weight of it in his hands made him feel sick, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem merely difficult. He'd spent hours researching robbery techniques online, studying security camera blind spots, memorizing escape routes. He felt like he was preparing for his own funeral. The plan was simple because it had to be. Find someone alone, someone who looked like they had money but wouldn't fight back. Get what he needed and disappear. Use the money for Maya's treatment and deal with the consequences later. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only plan he had left. As evening approached, Leo sat in his sister's room, watching her sleep. Maya's face was gaunt, her skin translucent enough that he could see the network of veins beneath. She looked like she was already halfway to somewhere else, and that thought made his chest tighten with panic. "I'm going to fix this," he whispered to her sleeping form. "I promise." He kissed her forehead. It felt like paper under his lips, and walked to the closet to retrieve the gun. The downtown district grew quiet after 6 o'clock, when the office workers retreated to the suburbs and left the streets to the people who lived in the margins. Frank Morrison was one of the few legitimate business people who stayed past sunset, but he had never felt unsafe in his neighborhood. There was an art to projecting the right kind of presence, and Frank had mastered it decades ago in places far more dangerous than urban America. He finished the day's work as the sun disappeared behind the skyline, casting long shadows through the workshop windows. The jewelry box was nearly complete, just a few more hours of detail work, and it would be ready for its final finish. Frank ran his fingers along the smooth wood, feeling for imperfections that existed only in his imagination. Perfectionism had kept him alive in his previous life. Now it simply made him a better craftsman. The evening ritual was as precise as the morning one. Tools cleaned and secured, work surfaces wiped down, lights checked, security system armed. Frank moved through the routine with the same systematic care he'd once used to field-strip weapons in the dark, muscle memory guiding his hands while his mind processed the day's accomplishments. The alley behind his workshop was narrow and poorly lit, but Frank knew every inch of it. He knew which dumpster belonged to which business, knew the pattern of foot traffic, knew the sound his boots made on the broken asphalt. What he didn't know was that Leo Vance had been watching him for the past hour, crouched behind a dumpster 30 feet away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Leo had chosen Frank for all the wrong reasons. The old man looked harmless, distracted, like someone who would comply rather than resist. He walked slowly, without the paranoid awareness that marked people who had been victims before. His truck was old but well-maintained, suggesting he had money but wasn't flashy about it. He was alone, in a quiet area, at a predictable time. From a criminal's perspective, Frank Morrison was the perfect target. Leo's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the gun, trying to steady his breathing. He had practiced this moment in his head 100 times, but his body was betraying him. His legs felt weak, his vision seemed to tunnel, and he could taste copper in his mouth. This wasn't how he'd imagined heroism would feel. Frank was 20 feet away now, keys in hand, walking toward his truck with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. Leo rose from his hiding spot, the gun heavy in his hand, and took a step forward. This was it, the moment that would save Maya's life or destroy his own. "Don't turn around." The words came out weaker than Leo had intended, his voice cracking like a teenager's. He cleared his throat and tried again, pressing the gun barrel against the back of Frank's jacket. "Don't turn around. Just give me the wallet and the keys." For Frank Morrison, the world shifted in an instant. Not into panic. He had been immune to panic for more than 4 decades, but into a state of heightened awareness that he hadn't accessed in years. Time seemed to slow, allowing him to process dozens of sensory inputs in the space between heartbeats. The voice behind him was young, maybe early 20s, scared. The words were rehearsed but delivered without conviction. The gun barrel, pressed against his jacket, was shaking, not the steady pressure of someone comfortable with violence, but the trembling of someone who had never done this before. Frank could smell cheap alcohol on the kid's breath, but underneath that was something else, desperation with an edge of righteous panic. Most telling of all was the positioning. The kid was standing too close, within arm's reach, and slightly off to Frank's left side. Amateur. Someone who had learned about armed robbery from movies instead of experience. Someone who didn't understand that proximity was a weapon that cut both ways. Frank's body remained perfectly still, but his mind was already running calculations. Distance to cover. Angle of approach. Most efficient way to disarm without killing. His hands, which had been holding his keys, relaxed slightly. The keys were now weapons. "Son," Frank said, his voice calm and measured, "you need to walk away right now." The steadiness of the response seemed to throw Leo off balance. He had expected fear, compliance, maybe pleading. He hadn't expected the kind of quiet authority that made his knees want to buckle. "I'm not playing games, old man," Leo said, trying to inject menace into his voice. "The wallet. Now." Frank's response was even quieter than before. "Neither am I." Leo pressed the gun harder against Frank's back, and that was his first mistake. The second was standing still long enough for Frank to map his exact location. The third was assuming that age equaled helplessness. Frank moved. The motion was so fast and fluid that Leo's mind couldn't process what was happening. One moment he was in control, holding a gun on an old man. The next, his wrist was caught in an iron grip that sent lightning bolts of pain up his arm. Frank had pivoted left, simultaneously blocking and redirecting the gun hand away from his body while stepping inside Leo's reach. The gun discharged into the empty air, the sound echoing off the alley walls like thunder. But by then, Frank's left hand had found Leo's elbow, applying pressure to the joint with surgical precision. Leo's fingers opened involuntarily, and the gun clattered to the asphalt. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds. Leo tried to pull away, but Frank's grip was like a mechanical vice. The old man stepped behind him, maintaining control of the arm while simultaneously sweeping Leo's legs. Leo hit the pavement hard, face first, with Frank's knee settling between. His shoulder blades with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "Stay down," Frank said quietly. Leo tried to push himself up, panic giving him strength, but Frank increased the pressure slightly. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to make it clear that resistance was futile. "I said stay down." The voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an authority that Leo had never encountered before. It was the voice of someone who had given orders in life-and-death situations, someone who expected compliance not through fear, but through absolute certainty. Leo's face was pressed against the cold asphalt, his arm twisted at an angle that made his shoulder scream. He could taste blood where his lip had split when he hit the ground. But more than the physical pain was the crushing realization that he had failed. Maya was going to die, and he had accomplished nothing except getting himself arrested. Frank held the position for 30 seconds, listening to the kid's ragged breathing, feeling the tension slowly drain out of the young body beneath him. When he was satisfied that the fight was over, he released the pressure and stood up, retrieving the gun from where it had fallen. Leo rolled onto his side, gasping, staring up at the man who had just dismantled him with terrifying efficiency. Frank looked the same as he had 5 minutes ago, grey hair, reading glasses, the appearance of a harmless retiree. But now Leo could see something else in his eyes, something that made his blood run cold. Frank checked the gun's cylinder, confirmed it was loaded, and engaged the safety with practiced ease. He had handled weapons like this thousands of times before, in places where a moment's carelessness meant death. "Get up," Frank said. Leo struggled to his feet, his legs unsteady. He expected to be marched to the street, to hear sirens, to be handed over to the police. Instead, Frank pocketed the gun and pulled out a set of keys. "We're going inside," Frank said, unlocking the workshop door. "Move." The workshop looked different in the evening light. The single overhead bulb created harsh shadows, transforming the peaceful workspace into something that felt more like an interrogation room. Frank guided Leo to a wooden stool and pushed him down onto it, then positioned himself behind his workbench like a judge behind a bench. Leo's eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes, weapons, anything that might give him an advantage. What he saw instead were tools that could double as instruments of violence: chisels, hammers, saws, all within Frank's reach and none within his own. Frank studied the young man in front of him with the same intensity he had once reserved for enemy combatants. Leo was skinny, maybe 160 pounds, with the kind of desperate energy that came from running on adrenaline and terror. His clothes were clean but worn, his sneakers held together with duct tape. He looked like he hadn't been eating regularly. "What's your name?" Frank asked. Leo said nothing, staring at the floor. Frank's voice remained patient. "I can call you whatever I want, or you can tell me your name. Your choice." "Leo." "Leo what?" "Vance." Frank nodded. "Leo Vance. 22, maybe 23 years old. First time doing this, judging by your technique. You're not a drug user. Your pupils are normal. Your hands are steady when you're not scared. You're not a career criminal. You held that gun like it was a snake. So why are you here, Leo Vance?" Leo looked up, surprised by the accuracy of Frank's assessment. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're desperate. I know you're scared. I know you'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now." Frank leaned forward slightly. "I also know you're not a killer. You want to know how I know that?" Leo didn't respond, but his eyes stayed fixed on Frank's face. "Because when I took that gun away from you, it was pointed at the ground. Your finger was outside the trigger guard. Those are good habits for someone who doesn't want to hurt anybody. Bad habits for someone trying to commit armed robbery." Frank stood up and walked around the workbench, moving with the same deliberate pace he used for everything else. Leo tensed, ready to run, but Frank simply pulled another stool over and sat down across from him. "Here's what I think happened," Frank continued. "You're in trouble, bad trouble, the kind that makes good people do stupid things. Someone you care about is in danger, and you can't save them the normal way, so you decided to try the abnormal way." Leo's composure cracked slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Frank's eyes were steady, unblinking. "Let me guess. Medical bills. Someone in your family is sick, and the treatment costs more than you can afford. You've tried everything else: loans, fundraising, charity applications. Every door has been slammed in your face. Now you're running out of time, and this was your last desperate attempt to get the money you need." Leo's face went white. "How did you—" "Because I've been around long enough to recognize desperation when I see it. And because you're not the first young man I've met who was willing to throw his life away for someone he loved." Frank stood up again, this time walking to a small refrigerator in the corner of the workshop. He pulled out 2 bottles of water and set one down in front of Leo. "Drink," he said. "Then tell me about her." Leo stared at the water bottle like it might be poisoned. "About who?" "The person you're trying to save." "Sister, I'm guessing, based on the way your face changed when I mentioned family. Younger sister." Leo's hands shook as he opened the water bottle. The first sip made him realize how thirsty he was, how long it had been since he'd eaten or drunk anything. The second sip made him realize he was going to cry. "Maya," he whispered. Frank nodded and sat back down. "Tell me about Maya." The words came out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. Leo told Frank about the diagnosis, the failed treatments, the experimental protocol that might save her life. He talked about his mother's exhaustion, his father's abandonment, the bills that kept coming like a paper avalanche. He described watching Maya waste away, seeing her smile less and sleep more, knowing that time was running out and he was powerless to stop it. Frank listened without interruption, his face impassive. He had heard similar stories before, in different contexts. Desperate soldiers who had stolen supplies to send money home to their families. Young Marines who had gone AWOL when they received word that their loved ones were in danger. The details were different, but the core emotion was the same: the willingness to sacrifice everything for someone you couldn't bear to lose. "How much?" Frank asked when Leo had finished. "What?" "How much does Maya need for the next treatment?" Leo wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. $47,000. The doctor says it needs to happen within 2 weeks, or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the workbench. Leo watched him, trying to read the older man's expression, but Frank's face revealed nothing. "You know what I did before I became a woodworker?" Frank asked finally. Leo shook his head. "I was a Marine. 25 years, most of it in force reconnaissance. You know what that is?" "Special forces?" "Something like that. My job was to find people who didn't want to be found, gather information that people didn't want to share, and solve problems that couldn't be solved through normal channels." Frank's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "I was good at it." Leo didn't know what to say to that. "The thing about being a Marine," Frank continued, "is that you learn to recognize different kinds of courage. There's the courage that comes from training and discipline. There's the courage that comes from anger or desperation. And there's the courage that comes from love." He stood up and walked to an old wooden desk in the corner of the workshop. Leo heard the sound of a drawer opening, papers rustling. "What you did tonight wasn't smart," Frank said, his back still turned. "It wasn't well planned, and it sure as hell wasn't legal. But it took courage. The wrong kind of courage, applied in the wrong way, but courage nonetheless." Frank returned to the workbench carrying a checkbook and a pen. Leo watched in stunned silence as the older man wrote out a check, tore it from the book, and slid it across the table. The check was made out to Leo Vance in the amount of $50,000. Leo stared at the piece of paper like it was written in a foreign language. I don't understand. It's not a gift, Frank said firmly. It's an advance against future wages. You're going to work for me starting tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. sharp. You'll sweep floors, sand wood, learn to use tools properly. You'll work off every penny of that money, plus interest. Leo's hands trembled as he picked up the check. Why would you do this? Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Because a long time ago, I had a young Marine in my unit who made a stupid mistake. He was desperate, scared, trying to solve a problem he wasn't equipped for. I could have destroyed his career, sent him to prison, made an example of him. Instead, I gave him a second chance. What happened to him? He went on to become one of the finest Marines I ever served with. Saved my life twice, actually. He's a police chief now, up in Portland. Has 3 kids and a grandchild on the way. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out Leo's gun. He expertly unloaded it, dropping the bullets into his palm, then slid both the weapon and the ammunition across the table. You take this back to whoever you got it from, Frank said. Tell them you're out of that business. Your fighting days are over. You're a builder now. Leo stared at the gun, then at the check, then at Frank. You're trusting me with this? After what I tried to do? Son, I've spent most of my adult life learning to read people. I can tell the difference between someone who's truly dangerous and someone who's just desperate. You're desperate. Desperate people can be helped. Frank stood up and walked to the workshop door, unlocking it and pulling it open. The night air flowed in, carrying the sounds of the city. Distant traffic, a siren somewhere in the distance, the elevated train rumbling past. Go home, Frank said. Take care of your sister. Be here at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. We'll start with the basics. How to hold a tool without hurting yourself. Leo stood up slowly, the check still clutched in his hand. He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Why? He asked. Why didn't you just call the police? Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting something that Leo couldn't quite identify. Because sometimes the system breaks down, and people like you and me have to find our own solutions. The police would have arrested you, given you a record, and your sister would have died while you were in prison. That doesn't help anybody. Leo nodded, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. Besides, Frank added, I could use the help. This place is too much for one old man to handle alone. Leo stepped into the alley behind the workshop, his mind reeling from everything that had just happened. The check felt surreal in his pocket, like something that might disappear if he looked at it too directly. The gun, unloaded now, seemed to weigh nothing at all. He had entered this alley as a desperate criminal, willing to hurt an innocent person to save his sister. He was leaving as… what? An employee. A project. A second chance wrapped in sandpaper and sawdust. The walk back to Marcus's apartment took 40 minutes, giving Leo time to process the evening's events. Every few blocks, he pulled out the check and stared at it under a streetlight, making sure the numbers were real. $50,000. Enough for Maya's treatment with money left over for the next one. Marcus answered his door with a suspicious frown that deepened when he saw Leo's scraped face and torn jacket. What happened to you? Marcus asked. Leo held out the gun and the bullets. I'm returning this. I don't need it anymore. Marcus looked at the weapon, then at Leo's face. You actually went through with it? You robbed someone? Something like that. Leo didn't know how to explain what had really happened. He wasn't sure he understood it himself. Well, good for you, man. I was starting to think you didn't have it in you. Leo shook his head. I don't. I'm done with all this. He walked away before Marcus could respond, leaving the other man standing in his doorway, holding an unloaded gun and a confused expression. The apartment was quiet when Leo returned. His mother was at her overnight job at the hospital, and Maya was sleeping in her room. Leo sat on the edge of his sister's bed, watching her breathe in the dim light from the hallway. Maya stirred and opened her eyes. Even in the darkness, Leo could see how thin her face had become, how the illness was eating her from the inside out. Leo, she whispered, you're late. Mom was worried. I had to take care of something, Leo said softly. But it's handled now. Maya smiled, the expression transforming her gaunt features. You look different, happier. Leo touched her forehead gently. Go back to sleep, Maya. Tomorrow we're going to call Dr. Thorne and schedule your next treatment. We don't have the money, Maya said, confusion clouding her eyes. We do now, Leo replied. I got a job. At 5:30 the next morning, Leo stood outside Morrison Woodworking, holding a cup of coffee and trying to understand how his life had changed so completely in the span of 12 hours. The check was safely deposited in his bank account. He had called the emergency banking line at 4 a.m. to confirm the funds were real and available. Maya's treatment was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Frank arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, parking his old pickup truck in the same spot as always. He looked at Leo for a moment, as if confirming something to himself, then unlocked the workshop door. You're on time, Frank said. Good. That's the first rule of any successful mission. Be where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there. Leo followed Frank into the workshop, breathing in the familiar scent of sawdust and wood polish. In the morning light, the space looked peaceful again, not at all like the interrogation room it had seemed the night before. Frank handed Leo a broom and pointed to the far corner of the workshop. Start there, sweep everything. When you're done with that, I'll show you how to sand properly. Leo took the broom and started working. The repetitive motion was oddly calming, giving his hands something to do while his mind processed everything that had happened. After a few minutes, he looked up to find Frank watching him. You have questions, Frank said. It wasn't a question. A few, Leo admitted. Ask them. Last night, when you stopped me, how did you do that? Frank smiled slightly. Practice. Lots and lots of practice. The Marine Corps spent a great deal of time and money teaching me how to neutralize threats without killing them. It's a useful skill set. Have you ever had to kill anyone? Frank's expression grew serious. That's not a question you ask someone, son, and it's not a question I'm going to answer. Leo nodded, understanding that he had crossed a line. Sorry. Don't apologize. Curiosity is natural, but some things are better left in the past. They worked in companionable silence for the next hour, Leo sweeping while Frank prepared materials for the day's projects. The rhythm was peaceful, almost meditative. Leo found himself thinking about the future for the first time in months, not just Maya's immediate survival, but what came after, what kind of person he wanted to become. Frank, Leo said eventually. Yeah? Thank you. Frank looked up from the piece of wood he was measuring. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen how hard I'm going to work you. Leo grinned, the first genuine smile he had managed in weeks. I can handle it. We'll see about that. The first thing you need to understand about woodworking is that it's not just about making things. It's about precision, patience, and respect. For the materials, for the tools, and for the process. You can't rush wood. You can't force it to do something it's not designed to do. You have to work with it, understand its nature, and guide it into becoming what it's meant to be. Frank picked up a piece of oak and ran his fingers along the grain. This piece of wood has been growing for maybe 50 years. It survived storms, droughts, insects, disease. It earned its strength through adversity. Now it's our job to honor that struggle by creating something beautiful and lasting. Leo understood that Frank wasn't just talking about woodworking. The jewelry box I'm finishing, Frank continued, is for a woman whose husband died in Afghanistan. She's going to keep his medals in it, and someday she'll pass it down to their daughter. That box needs to be perfect, not because anyone will notice if it's not, but because the love it represents deserves perfection. Frank handed Leo a piece of sandpaper and a block of pine. Start with this. Smooth, even strokes. Feel the wood's response to the pressure. Learn to listen to what it's telling you. Leo began sanding, focusing on the rhythm and the gradually changing texture of the wood beneath his hands. It was tedious work, but there was something satisfying about watching the rough surface become smooth and polished. Frank, Leo said after a while. Yeah? That Marine you told me about last night. The one who made a mistake. What about him? Was he real? Frank was quiet for a long moment, his hands never pausing in their work. His name was Danny Rodriguez, 19 years old, from El Paso. His mother was dying of cancer, and the family couldn't afford the treatments. He stole medical supplies from the base infirmary, planning to sell them to pay for her care. What did you do? I made him a deal. He would work off the value of what he'd stolen, plus interest by taking on extra duties around the base. Kitchen duty, latrine cleaning, equipment maintenance. He worked 18-hour days for 6 months. And his mother? I pulled some strings, got her into a veterans medical program through her late husband's service record. She lived another 8 years, long enough to see Danny graduate from college and become a police officer. Leo understood now why Frank had made the same choice with him. Do you ever regret it, not turning him in? Frank smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. Danny Rodriguez saved my life twice in Iraq. Once when our convoy hit an IED, and once when we were pinned down by sniper fire. He's got 3 kids now, all college-bound. His oldest daughter wants to be a doctor. So, no regrets. No regrets, Frank confirmed. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is give them a chance to prove they're better than their worst moment. They worked until noon, when Frank called a break for lunch. Leo's back ached from the unfamiliar movements, and his hands were sore from gripping tools, but he felt more at peace than he had in months. The work was honest, productive, and peaceful. Everything his life had been lacking. Maya's treatment is scheduled for Friday, Leo said as they sat eating sandwiches that Frank had brought from home. Good. You'll need to leave early that day to be with her. I can make up the time. No, Frank said firmly. Family comes first. The work will wait. Leo nodded, struck by the simple kindness of the statement. In his desperate scramble to save Maya, he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated with basic human decency,